If you're a Kurd in the Iranian context, and if you are living close to Azerbaijani Turks, and if they sell, for instance, fruit in the market, you have to know enough Turkish to go and buy the fruit from them. You know that the nation state, the official language of the nation state is Persian, so obviously you're going to learn it. At the same time, you know that because you're Kurdish, you're going to be discriminated against, and you may not have access to university, and you might go to a country like Canada. So at the same time, you learn English as well, or French for that matter, if you want to go to Quebec. So these people are functioning pretty well. I mean, the only problem is they're oppressed from morning to night. So probably, I think if we just let go of this sense of control and allow people really to use the kind of the communicative skills that they prefer or they deem best in different contexts, I think we're going to see the creation of a social cohesion which is more organic, which is more meaningful, and is really kind of is better built in different ways.
Why knowledge matters. Welcome to a new episode. I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Amir Kalan. Amir Kalan is a professor of education at DISE, Department of Integrated Studies of Education at the Faculty of Education at McGill University in Montreal. Welcome, Amir. Such a pleasure to have you finally on the show. And so, yeah, really, really nice.
Thank you so much, Yannick. It's all the pleasure is mine. It's wonderful to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Now, let's start. And who is actually Amir Kamal in one sentence, if this is enough? I don't think so, but let's try.
Sure, yeah. My name is Amir Kalan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill University. In my work, I studied the cultural, social, and power-relational aspects of literacy. So what I'm interested in is basically what happens beyond the text. So how text is used by different social groups and for what purposes, and how our educational structures decide about what kinds of reading and writing our students should engage with. So as one example of what it means to move beyond the text and look at the politics of literacy and sociocultural aspects of literacy is really what minoritized and racialized students do with literacy in multicultural and multilingual contexts. I'm, for instance, very much interested in the experiences of immigrants with reading and writing when they arrive in their host nations. Another example of my work is a focus on reading and writing and language use in times of crisis. I look at, for instance, how people in jail use writing, how exiled writers engage with publishing in their new homes, and I look at how minoritized populations use writing as a form of resistance. For instance, how asylum seekers, in the process of their journeys, use writing to report the dangers and the challenges that they face. So altogether, I believe that what I do as a whole resembles something that I call creating a sociology of literacy, because it's about the social aspects and the political aspects of literacy, or language use, and reading and writing.
That is so interesting. Now, what brought you into this specific area of interest, the sociology of literacy, Amir?
So there were a couple of different personal experiences that guided really my research towards this direction. So I've always been a teacher in my life. I've always taught language and writing. Uh, so one observation that a lot of teachers, a lot of researchers internationally probably share with me is how our educational establishments fail minoritized students. So we have all the data we need to know that if you're racialized, if you're minoritized, uh, uh, public educational systems fail you. So one big question has always on my mind been how does it happen? So there are, of course, different forms of discrimination, including different forms of racism and kind of more systemic discrimination, like a very kind of the distribution of resources, which is not really ideal, as we know. So some populations seem to receive more resources than others. So next to these, I think what attracted my attention was how we define literacy, how we define reading and writing. Apparently, the way what we call academic writing, which is really kind of the language of a schooling, which may not be used in academic spheres really, seemingly has been designed in a way that does a favor minoritized educations because they engage with other forms of literacy and other forms of reading and writing. So one major kind of motivation for me has always been how do we challenge our notions of literacy to create a space for minoritized students' literacy practices in our educational settings. That's been one kind of personal connection with this. The other one, which really kind of reflects another part of my research trajectory, has been a question of language policy and planning, and how, at the level of nation states, um, 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 different nations create linguistic hierarchies. So some of my research has been in the context of Iranian Plateau and Iran, the country, and I have been criticizing the Persian-only educational structures, and I've been looking at what happens to other languages when they are not allowed to be used in the schools as the language of instruction. So I'm Iranian Canadian, so I have that connection. And for a long time, I've been thinking about that problem because it's quite clear that seemingly innocent language planning and policy has resulted in the minoritization of different cultures. And for political purposes and economic purposes. So language has been used as a tool to prevent the growth, the economic and cultural growth of different communities. Another personal connection is my own experiences as an immigrant to Canada. So I arrived in Canada in 2010, and I knew English. I used to teach English for really a couple of decades before I got to Canada, but still I found things challenging. So the question I had was, so how Canadian institutions and rules and regulations challenge immigrants through language, but at the same time, I think those challenges are not really about language. I mean, it's really something beyond the language. For instance, what are some of the practices of writing CVs and resumes? And how do Canadian employers read CVs and resumes with non-Anglo-American names on them, for instance? So, what are some of the assessment strategies of Canadian educators, and how those assessment strategies favor actually Canadians or Europeans in different ways who speak English as the first language? What are the dynamics of standardized tests? What happens? How do standardized tests evaluate immigrants when they want to become, for instance, citizens or before they want to get into the country? And what are some of the economic aspects of this? As we know, for instance, the standardized testing has become a huge industry, and there is a lot of money in that industry. So, with the presence of that money and the availability of profit, are these standardized testing kind of apparatuses functioning the way they should be? Meaning, is it really all about evaluation of the language of these immigrants? Or there is much more. So I typically look at what is around it. So as an immigrant, I've been struggling with these, wrestling with all these institutional demands and dimensions. So that brings me into that conversation as well. So these are really three different ways that attract me to studying these political dimensions and sociocultural dimensions of language use and literacy.
Yeah, it's so interesting because obviously it's also a very specific context we live in. Obviously, Quebec and Canada, you have a majority obviously is English speaking, and then you have a minority who is French speaking, and then you have also indigenous languages. So many, so there's a lot of complexity there. How do you think like we could reconcile this gap and especially bring this diversity somehow into the mainstream, because it seems to me too a really a hard task actually to do when we look at the practical application. And I really agree that obviously language is so powerful, right? And it's really hard to actually navigate it and to actually also get somehow a grip on it and what it means and what it doesn't mean, and therefore it is so important actually what you are doing. So give us like a taste on how you would like to envision like this mosaic of different languages that we have here, especially in Canada, which is so rich, from immigrants, from new immigrants,
Mhm.
from people who came here, because ultimately we are all at some point we were immigrants, except the indigenous population.
Absolutely. That's a very important question, and probably at the end of each article, I have to go back to that question. Really, what are some of the implications of what I'm doing? So, in order to answer that question, I want to move away a little bit from Canada, but I come back to it. I want to move away from Canada because there is in Canada a recognition, at least, of official bilingualism, and there is a recognition of a linguistic mosaic, but that's not necessarily the case in every country. So generally speaking, I think one a huge problem is, I mean, when I did different trends of my research, I realized that all of them, when I started from schools, when I started from language policy and planning at the national level, or when I looked at the experiences of immigrants, all of these research trends guided me towards a key concept: nation statism. So seemingly there is something seriously wrong with nation state conceptualizations or the European nation state model. As we know, the Germans and later on the French and other European countries, including the Italians and the rest of the European countries, I think created, actually engaged in an experiment, which was the creation of the modern nation state. That modern nation state, I mean, the model, the theorization, actually relied heavily on the notion of language and ethnicity. So, practically, in their definition of what a nation should be, language was crucial. So, a nation was equal to a language. We know that this is not accurate. So all societies are multilingual, and this is really an illusion to imagine that you can have a nation based on a language. It is very famous in sociology of language that it's a very famous saying that a language cannot make a nation. A nation state fabricates a language. So, unfortunately, this model was based on an illusion. Part of the creation of this illusion and this kind of this model, this unrealistic model, was creating modern, if you go back to philosophers like Hegel and Fichte and all the kind of the German group, and later on, of course, the French contributed to that a great deal as well. So the idea was, if we want to just impose this monolingual regime, we are going to need different kind of institutions, modern institutions. So the public schools or mass education through public schools and universities, in a way, had the role of imposing monolingualism on populations who didn't speak the dominant language. So, and that has been functioning, I think, for a couple of centuries now, and with a terrible price. I think a lot of during these processes, what Europeans have been doing is really what we call a process of debabelization. They have tried to reduce the number of languages and to highlight the status of dominant languages in each state. So I think if you look at the problem, just going back to your question, how can we recognize the linguistic mosaic? I think if you look at the root of the problem as nation statism and the official languages that they have created, I think we can really get close to a conversation about what the solutions are. So, for instance, I think the Canadians at some point decided that the solution might be official bilingualism. So, why should we have only one language? Why not two? So, we know today that part of that recognition has been actually peacemaking between the two colonial populations in Canada, English speaking populations and French speaking populations. So now, for instance, I suggest I've written about this and I've spoken to different journalists about this that maybe it's time to move beyond the colonial conflict between French and English and start recognizing the other languages, but following on the good tradition that Canada has already established, which is we can actually imagine the inclusion of other languages as well. So the solution, I think, is really a recognition of the fact that nation statism is just a kind of a nation statism based on one language only is an illusion, and whatever we do, we're gonna always have multiple languages spoken and used in any society in the world. Even if we have only one language, imagine French, we know that there is always a process of heteroglossa, meaning any language is going to produce different varieties of its own. So that's why Quebecois French is different from Parisian French, because languages just evolve, they create varieties. That's why upper class, for instance, or what they call academic English is different from spoken colloquial English. So just a recognition of the fact that there are really different varieties of English. But there is a question of applications, and I think that's a very, very important question. So I think for applications, we really need to look at different contexts and which particular application we are looking at, because when we're talking about application, I think we might have the idea of how to educate, for instance, a group of recently arrived refugees, for instance, in Canada, some younger children. So obviously, when it comes to applications through the lens of plurilingualism, you're gonna have a particular approach, but another practical application might be: is it possible to write doctoral dissertations in different languages? So if that's the question, I think the application is going to be really different. I think once we have recognized that different communities have a right to use the language, I think if we give them this legal power and if we support them and give them the resources they need, I believe that at a kind of a community level, people start negotiating and people find the best ways to do that. So, for instance, a Kurdish a scholar approached me, and she wanted to do a PhD with me, but she wanted to write it in Kurdish. And I can understand some Kurdish, and I know Kurdish scholars in Canada actually who could be on her committee. But McGill doesn't allow you, policy wise, to supervise a dissertation which is not in English or French. So at this level, I think the solution is really easy. The solution is just we can do that and we'll sort it out. We know how to make it happen. But the policy and planning, I think, has prevented even a conversation about that or individual attempts. So, just to summarize, I think the solution to that problem is really just recognizing the root of the problem, which is nation statism, and which is a kind of big political illusion. Once we have realized that one state, one official language, or in case of Canada, two official languages, is an illusion, I think we'll start really thinking about alternative possibilities. Unfortunately, hand in hand with the idea of language, as I briefly described at the beginning, is really other cultural dimensions. So one reason that traditionally this space hasn't been created uh, is a problem which is really bigger than language. The problem is if you don't speak European languages like English and French, and even Spanish, for instance, in the case of U.S. and Mexico, because these are all colonial languages. So the assumption is, if you don't speak these languages, you cannot produce kind of knowledge which is worthy of attention. You don't even have any ideas. So I mean, there is some kind of somehow a more problematic layer actually to these policies that are not typically discussed. So if we talk to the people who wrote this policy for McGill, they obviously are going to give you the technical problems or problems related to resources. But I think deep down there is another idea that producing dissertations in English and French is going to guarantee that we are the knowledge holders, and we can gatekeep the flow of knowledge. So I think a question of practical application is very important. First, we have to identify context, and second, we have to be aware of the political dimensions of that argument as well, because sometimes the solution is really, really easy. In the case of the Turkish student who approached me, sorry, the Kurdish student who approached me, the solution was really easy. I mean, we are going to have committee members who can understand, make sense of the dissertation, and she's going to write the dissertation. But I think the policy, hand in hand with all these historical and socio-political dimensions, wouldn't let it happen. And I think this is not going to happen for a long time to come either.
Yeah, this is so interesting, and you mentioned some very important points, and I think it also has to some extent. It's almost like a guardianship too for making sure those, especially languages at risk, are somehow preserved and continue really to grow. Whether it's here in Canada or in other places, but we know that. Languages are in danger, in many places, and especially where we have a political system that are even more oppressive in this regard. So it's really, really difficult, and I can also relate to here heavily to indigenous languages, where
Mm.
there's also another issue with how to actually make sure that you keep delivering also the people who actually teach still these languages if they are marginalized. So this is a whole other issue, obviously, that comes with it. And then in addition, we have these whole problems here in general, but not just in Canada, in Europe throughout. I mean, in Switzerland too, they have a scarcity of teachers and so on. So the whole our whole notion also that we have about education, especially public education, is a
Mhm.
whole other story. And then, of course, with nationhood, I think that's really, really important. What you are, researching. What does your work give you personally at the really personal level?
So at a personal level, I think I have the pleasure of learning from all these populations whose knowledges have been kind of denied completely. So you spoke about the indigenous languages in Canada. I think that's a really seriously important question. I think so. In my previous comments, I was talking about the underlying kind of notion that people who speak other languages don't have any knowledge worthy of attention. And I said that it comes from that colonial mentality. Now imagine if we change that mentality and if we look at the everyday problems we have in the world. So we all know that we're dealing with a huge kind of environmental disaster, and lo and behold, who has the knowledge about how to deal with that? I think indigenous populations, First Nations, and their philosophies offering solutions that Western thought hasn't really paid any attention to for centuries. So if we just change our lens and if we say that, okay, I don't want to revive these languages or these endangered languages or these kind of oppressed languages as a kind of act of charity, but I really believe that there is some knowledge in them that I can learn from that for everyday solutions like the environment and other things. I think that can change the equation completely, and that's really the what I get out of this. I really learn from the experiences of these different populations that I study, where it be kind of members of minority languages or speakers of minority languages in international contexts, or if it's from immigrants in Canada. I believe that despite our notion, and you referred to the kind of the function of mass education and public schools and all these institutions as well. I think the research, my research tells me more and more that a lot of what we do in these institutions is just to sustain that institutional and racial and economic and political dominance, the status quo. So if I want to learn about real literacy practices, I have to go out. I have to talk to the youth in Montreal to see how they rap. And of course, they rap in multiple languages. So for them, multilingualism is okay. It's just there, and we're gonna rap in multiple languages. I take a look at how, for instance, people in the Kurdish resistance use language and use writing. So I think this is really the kind of the personal thing for me. I think I learn a great deal from these populations, and because of my job, I can communicate it to, for instance, pre-series teachers who go to public schools and say that there are all these amazing forms of literacy engagement, and and I think that could become part of everyday practice as well. So that's really what gives me a lot of pleasure. I mean, personally. At the same time, I think all these kind of different kinds of language use and the literacy activities of these populations are connected to larger political movements and larger ideological movements. And I believe that with my involvement in that as a privileged professor at McGill University, I can contribute to those movements as well. So I believe that it's a form of a form of activist involvement uh, in collective in finding collective solutions to our current problems as well. So it makes me feel much better actually when I look at it this way, that I'm not only a prof in an office at McGill. I'm in conversation with all these amazing teachers, students, activists, and writers, and that makes me feel I'm useful. In my current project, I'm in conversation with a huge number of exiled writers or immigrant writers, or probably broadly, let's call them displaced writers, because we know that we are living in unprecedented times when it comes to migration patterns. We haven't had such a huge kind of international move, I think, in decades, really, probably if not centuries. But I think they say right now that we are speaking, I think we have a migration of about 280 million people. Just thinking about this population is mind-boggling. A lot of these people are writers who have to leave the countries for different reasons. So I'm working with these writers. We are talking about their experiences, and I think that connection is very important to me. I really want to be in conversation with these people and see what happens to uh, this kind of underground or unofficial literacy and writing activities.
Yeah, that's so important. And another aspect also what also plays into this whole mosaic is the fact too that social cohesion is also very important. And at least when we look at the news, there is also something to be said about the importance to have somehow, to find somehow common ground that we agree upon. And I think this is also more and more, it becomes more difficult to actually find somehow like common ground. How do you reconcile, this of wanna living together in peace, have a fruitful conversation, and on the other hand, we are more and more, we are somehow, because in the past, right, we had like at least, when you looked 3, 4, 500,000 years back, at least we had something in common, right? It was monotheism, let's say, the Abrahamic religions, right? They knew, okay, we have a different way of looking at the world, but at least we agree that there is only one god, let's say, or whatever. And so this is really completely more and more dissipating. So how can multilingual education here like really play a role in somehow you know help this social cohesion to somehow creatively, again, to forge a creative, coming together, where something new, something more powerful can actually emerge in terms of, let's say science, but also art, right? Because we see that also in the Middle East. Why the Middle East? Because there were always different people from different nations came together and something new emerged, right? Different religion emerged and so on, right? Because people actually crossed their path, right? And something new can emerge. And now, right now, we basically face the same thing, but at least perceived. And I think this is social media in general has, in my view, a catastrophic effect on people. Because if you do not engage actually with people on a day to day basis anymore, then you start living almost like you at least perceived, you think like, wow, that's really hell, or this is like, you know so how
Yeah,
can multilingual education help us somehow to find a more peaceful, a more creative way of coming together?
absolutely. I think it's very important first to really have a kind of accurate understanding of social cohesion. So As you said, I think some of that really might be our kind of understanding of a crisis of social cohesion might be really just the media, and particularly social media as well. I'm not sure how accurate it is because the reality is, over the past decades, nation states have gathered a huge amount of power, actually, and control. So, in a sense, I think one can argue that we are really more alike than ever. Think about the impact of social media and how the youth in the world internationally can communicate, can see what is happening around the world. On the other end of your argument, you talked about when there was at least one God, but we know historically that, for instance, within Christianity itself, there was a lot of blood shed. So there was hardly a kind of agreement at that time as well. So I think what we can do is probably first be very really precise and evidence based about social cohesion. I believe that people want to have cohesion and connection and interaction. I believe that people and communities want peace with other communities. I believe that humans by nature want to learn and want to collaborate. Um, uh, the problem is usually, I think, that this social cohesion, like a kind of top-down approach, is imposed by typically, I think, now in current age by nation states, but with different kind of cultural and social elites as well. So I think when you want to impose that social cohesion, I think, yes, if you're rich and if you have resources, I think it might work for a while. But if suddenly there is an economic crisis like we are witnessing in the West and in Canada to some extent as well, so things go wrong because people don't just listen to you. And so I think the first step is really just thinking about that social cohesion. I mean, our definition of social cohesion and what it really means when and how it has manifested itself. I believe, but I think the question is very interesting because I think it really highlights the connection of multilingualism with this. I believe that allowing multilingualism might kind of create a space for connections, not only between uh, the subjects and the center, which used to be the king and now it's the state. I think this has been really the trend. But multilingualism, I mean, allowing for more multilingualism, might create interaction between different communities, the communities that can interact in neighboring communities. So, in what I do, I write a lot about organic language and literacy practices. So, instead of creating a kind of top down, prescribed cohesion, I think if we think about how multilingualism function, I think we can have really organic forms of different communities coming together and choosing the languages they want to communicate with another. Again, I prefer to learn from what is already happening in the world. So, in any kind of any border area in Africa or India, for instance, or even in Iranian plateau, people use multiple languages and they know exactly when they should use those languages, how much of those languages they need, and how to use those languages. And there is no problem whatsoever, although these nation states are really imposing kind of a toxic monolingualism on them. But those people have to coexist. So, for instance, again, I give an example of the context I know. So, if you're a Kurd in the Iranian context, and if you are living close to Azerbaijani Turks, and if they sell, for instance, fruit in the market, you have to know enough Turkish to go and buy the fruit from them. You know that the nation state, the official language of the nation state is Persian, so obviously you're going to learn it. At the same time, you know that because you're Kurdish, you're going to be discriminated against, and you may not have access to university, and you might go to a country like Canada. So at the same time, you learn English as well, or French for that matter, if you want to go to Quebec. So these people are functioning pretty well. I mean, the only problem is they're oppressed from morning to night. So probably, I think if we just let go of this sense of control and allow people really to use the kind of the communicative skills that they prefer or they deem best in different contexts, I think we're going to see the creation of a social cohesion which is more organic, which is more meaningful, and is really kind of is better built in different ways. So rather than controlling or designing this social cohesion from a from I don't know from a room in an office in the government or something, I think that we should allow these communities to decide what languages they want to use and what texts they want to publish, and I believe that there would be a kind of organic development of these.
Yeah, absolutely. That is wonderful, and ultimately, life is all about somehow, meaning and purpose. And I think it's about creating and seeking for meaning. And what better tool as actually language, right? Because there's so different ways there are so many languages that they have words that we don't have, and vice versa. And so it's truly a gift, I would say, all the languages that we have in our world, and somehow we have to make sure that we cherish them. Amir, what makes you feel alive?
Um, I think conversations like this, just to talk to thinkers, to educators, to people, to friends, to colleagues. I think I love that kind of human connection and intellectual connection. I think that, of course, includes my family. So I think my family is extremely important to them, and their experiences, and again what I can learn from them, and how we can support each other, and really the process of just writing, and you were talking about making meaning. So in a way, I think that the process of meaning making and the creativity that it requires uh, uh, really makes me feel alive and still in charge. I know that in different historical periods we have to deal with different crises and problematic situations, uh, but I think a belief in human creativity and our ability to create meaning, and to probably identify the truth from misinformation, at least after a while. I think that keeps me alive. Yeah.
Amir Kalan, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yannick. I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you for doing this work.
Thank you so much, Professor Amir Kalan. Thank you so much for being a gift to me and really to the world. Thank you so much. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.